Ladies and gentlemen, on this night, it is my honor to present to you a leader of the grassroots movement, a man of faith who unites us all in our fight for a country that is morally just and a country that gives us hope. Join me in welcoming Reverend Dr. William J. Barbour. It's my honor. Thank you.
Hello, Michigan. It's good to be here with you. I'm so honored to be here tonight. And as my grandmother said, the older you get, you're so honored to be anywhere, any night. I do want to thank God for the privilege, and I also want to ask the light person if they can get a little of this glare out. My eyes aren't as strong as they used to be, may not be able to do anything. I also want to thank Dave Noble and Sister Miller, the executive director and the deputy director of the ACLU in Michigan. I want you to know that all the people you just saw are the kinds of people that are coming together across races and the lines that separate us by race, religion, sexual orientation, and finding that we all have to join together and address the 5 interlocking injustices of systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. There are moments in history that we have to have our silos, but we can't live in our silos. And we need to understand why we have to come together. So I want you to do something. If you got your cell phone and you'd like to be connected, we're on a 25-state tour called the We Must Do More Tour, mobilizing, organizing, registering, educating people for the movement who vote, along with my co-chair, the Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, and 43 state coordinating committees and 120 partners. And we're leading to June 2020. I want you to remember that, where we're calling for a mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington. Tens of thousands of people will join to put the face of poverty in front of the nation, but also we believe in the agency of poor and impacted people, that they also can challenge the nation and show the nation a way forward. It will be a time not just where people are speaking on behalf of poor and low-wealth people, but poor and low-wealth people speaking on their own behalf and challenging the structures of this nation. So if you can pull out your phones and dial and text the word M-O-R-A-L, moral, to 90975. M-O-R-A-L, moral, to the number 90975. And if you don't want to pull it out right now, write it down on your napkin and do it later. I've been thinking about this night quite a bit, Brother Noble and others who are here, what I would say. I looked at all of these powerful actions, the decision that came down in 2017 to knock down barriers for students with disabilities, your work. 2016, the class action lawsuit you filed against the state of Michigan and local school district, the work you've done in Flint, the federal class action lawsuit challenged discriminatory cash bail system, and the work you have done for decades. And then listening in the back to the awardees, let's give them a big round of applause one more time. And so tonight, I want to suggest that it's always the right time to do the ACLU. You'll understand it in a minute. Look at somebody and said, we need to keep doing. Come on now, y'all. We need to keep doing the ACLU. One of the things that bothers me the most is when I hear people make this statement. Two of them, actually. One is, we've never seen anything like this before in America. And I wonder, what kind of history classes did they take? The other thing that bothers me is when people say this is the era of Donald Trump. Now, as a person of faith, I don't give any era to any person. And even my atheist friends say amen to that. It was 1919, 1920, 100 years ago. Racial riots against blacks were breaking out because of post-World War I tensions. As W.B. Du Bois said, we return home. And he said we would be jackasses, this is W.B. Du Bois's words, to have fought in the war overseas and not stand for justice back home. It was 1920, and the demobilization of veterans, both black and white, was happening. At the same time, America was in an economic slump. And there was a great competition for jobs because the greedy in business wanted to keep their money and make their goods as cheap as they could and work people as hard as they could, and so they didn't want to expand the workforce. It was 1919, 1920. Housing among ethnic European Americans and African Americans was a point of division. It was a time of labor unrest in which some industrialists used black people as strike breakers to increase the resentment among black and white people, working people, poor people, who literally should have been allies, which is one of the things that A. Philip Randolph would try to teach to the union movement. It was 1919, 1920. The federal government claimed that they feared socialist and communist influence, and they declared that these soldiers who were patriots and had fought for America were now bringing communist thoughts back to America simply because they wanted to have first class citizenship, just like they had given first class blood. It was 1919, 1920. The civil rights activist and author of the Black National Hymn, Lift Every Voice and Sing, James Weldon Johnson, the executive secretary of the NAACP, he coined that time Red Summer. Red Summer. The manpower mobilization of World War I, there had been an immigration cutoff. This time, or that time, it wasn't on the southern border, it was on the shores of the Atlantic. For the fear of immigrants then were the immigrants coming from Europe. Industrial cities in the Northeast and Midwest had experienced severe shortages during the war, so manufacturers, one writer says, recruited throughout the South. And there was this first migration of black workers, 500,000 by 1919 had come to the North and the Midwest. But it was never the plan of those owners to treat those workers right. The plan was simply to make money off of them, and then when the war was over, to get rid of them. African-American workers filled the positions. They expanded the industries. They worked on the railroads, and they held many of the jobs that had been held by whites. And then the demobilization of the war, people coming back home, wealthy, greedy business folk pitted people against each other, increased resentment against blacks among many working class whites, immigrants, and first-generation Americans. It was 1919, 1920, when riots were happening all over this country, putting black men in their place. I just left the hollers of Kentucky, organizing among Kentucky coal miners just 2 days ago, and we were in Corbin, Kentucky, where in 1919, over an alleged criminal act, and that was always, most of the time, how the riots got started. Somebody alleged or profiled a black man. Is that Rashida? Congresswoman? Hey, Congresswoman Rashida. Hey, give her a big hand. That's my Congresswoman, and I'm not even from Michigan. I was in Corbin, Kentucky, where they alleged, they racially profiled a man, said he had done something, and in less than 2 days, they packed up every black man, woman, and child, put them on a rail car, and said, don't ever come back. And racists have used, ever since that day, pitted black folk against poor white folk in those hills and made them think that their problems are because of certain things coming to black and brown people. And we were just there the other day organizing because some folk are waking up. It was 1919. There was the removal of price controls. There was unemployment. There was inflation that was beginning to creep into the American society because of the greed and the monopolization of industry. And then America elected a racist to the White House. I said 1919. Actually, he'd been elected in 1914, but in 1919, he was beginning his second term. He was a racist, he was a narcissist, he had been president of Princeton University, governor of New Jersey. Racism is not just a Southern matter. He was spewing division. He was lifting up revisionist history. And he was glorifying white nationalism in 1919. And this president said, the American Negro returning from abroad would be the greatest medium in conveying Bolshevism to America. In other words, fear the returning American soldier because they are the conduit for socialism and communism, because that has always, especially in the 20th century, that has always been the curse word, the label you put on anybody that believes in justice. And it was in the midst of all of this division, all of this chaos, all of this racism from the White House. The president at that time, 100 years before Banner was in the White House, the president in the early 1900s had played the movie Birth of a Nation in the White House to all of his staff and declared that this was the history that America needed to operate on. And in the midst of that, somebody decided we need to do the ACLU. The only way we can address this is by doing the ACLU. And the ACLU, for me tonight, means the only way you can address certain moments in history is you have to act, you have to challenge, you have to love, and you have to unite. That's doing the ACLU. And here we are 100 years later. 23 states in the United States of America since 2010, 6 years before Trump or Russia, passed racist voter suppression laws that impacts 54% of all African Americans. But here is the rub that isn't often talked about even in the media. If you do an analysis of the states that have passed racist voter suppression laws, and I want to keep saying before Russia, before Trump, because we need to understand what Neil Painter said, that Trump is not the problem, he's the symptom. I knew I wasn't going to get too many claps for that. Because the danger of America is we keep wanting to isolate racism into somebody who's crazy when racism is a part and parcel of who America is. And by racism, we're not necessarily talking about those who call you the N-word or say a bunch of crazy words. Kendi, in his new book on Stamped from the Beginning, lets us know that oftentimes the words are the distraction. In some ways, the most racist person in Washington, D.C. right now in the nation is Mitch MCConnell. And you haven't heard him on TV saying the ugly word. But racism is about policy, not just about name calling. How many lawyers in here know what I'm talking about? Racism is about disparate treatment under the law. Racism is about defying equal protection under the law for everybody. So you can be quiet and be a racist. You can be black and be a racist. Because if you're black and an elected officer and you vote with those who are engaged in policies that have disparate treatment, at best you are an enabler of racism. At worst, you are a racist joined up with white nationalism. Here we are. And do you know, we did an analysis in the Poor People's Campaign and we found out that every state that passes racist voter suppression laws, just like it has always been, the people who get elected using racist voter suppression laws, once they get elected, they use their power to hurt mostly poor white folk. I knew that wouldn't go over too well, so let me prove it. Because I don't believe in being loud and wrong. We did a study and looked at poverty. And we found out that every state that is a racist voter suppression state is a high poverty state. I didn't say black poverty, high poverty state, a denial of living wage state, a denial of health care state, an attack public education state, an attack LGBTQ people state, an attack women's rights state. So that all you have to know is that a state has tried to engage in racist voter suppression and is in some way succeeded. There is almost a correlation to the causation. And so if that's true, which we've shown it to be true, our economists and others did a study for us called The Souls of Poor Folk, auditing America 50 years after the original Poor People's Campaign. And we found out that there are not 39 million poor people in America. There are 140 million poor and low-income people in America. And 66 million of them are white. 26 million of them are black. Now here's the rub. That 26 million black represents 61% of black people. That 66 million white only represents about 30% of white people. So in terms of percentage, there are more black people as a part of their race that are poor and low wealth. But in terms of raw numbers, there are more poor whites in raw numbers. And Dr. King said years ago that any time the demographic shift, I'm paraphrasing him now from a speech he did at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, he said anytime there is the potential for poor whites and poor blacks to form together demographically to build political power, the greedy, racist aristocracy always sows division. Here we are. For instance, in this state, 51% of all residents, black residents, have cities living under emergency management. That's racism. Spending in our federal prisons has gone up 10 times since 1976. That is a form of systemic racism. Native American people are still considered wards of the state. They can get casinos, but they can't get brand new housing and schools. That's a form of systemic racism. 58,000 people in prison, over 55% of the people of color, black residents in Michigan, incarcerated at 6 times the rate of white residents. That's a form of racism, systemic racism. Resegregation of our public schools, form of racism. 100 years later. 100 years later, as I said, there are 140 million poor and low-income people in the United States, 39 million children. 39 million children. And 7 people died from vaping, and we called it a national emergency. I want you to go somewhere with me. Because it was here at Grosse Pointe that Dr. King did a speech a few days before he was shot, talking about 2 Americas, 1968. When one innocent, unarmed black person gets shot by a racist cop, we hit the streets, and we should. But 100 years later, 250,000 people die every year from poverty. 600 a day. And you can hardly get a candidate running for president to even say the word poverty at 3 events, if they ever say it. They say working class. And 43% of the people in this country are poor and low wealth. $300 and $400 away from bankruptcy and deep hurt. Michigan, 41% of the people are poor and low wealth. 4 million residents. This is not a marginal issue. It's not just a black issue. 50% of all the children in Michigan. The majority of the poor people in Michigan are white people, 2.7 million. 36% of all white people, 58% of all people of color, 1.4 million. In Michigan, 100 years later, after you began doing the ACLU, 60 million people in this country work for less than $15 an hour. 2 million people in Michigan's workforce work for less than $15 an hour. 46% of Michigan's workforce. That's why I went somewhere and some preachers got mad with me because I said it's a shame and a disgrace for a preacher to ask members to tithe and then won't get in the street and fight for them to have a living wage. There's something wrong. I just don't believe Jesus would be this quiet in the midst of all of this kind of economic pain that the truth be told, even the media doesn't want to talk about. 100 years later. 30-some million people that don't have health care, even though every congressperson and senator and governor that works to block people's health care gets free health care themselves, paid for by us. I had one congressperson say, no, they don't. They said, I don't get free health care, I pay for it. I said, but with whose money? You pay for it with the money that we pay you. So how in the world can you have something and not want your constituents to have at least what you have? And in Michigan, 600,000 people are still uninsured. 600,000 people. There's not a county in the country, nowhere in this country, where you can afford a 2-bedroom apartment on minimum wage. Not one. In Michigan, you have to work 73 hours a week in Michigan at minimum wage to possibly afford a 2-bedroom apartment. Yes, Flint. And thank God for the work you've done in Flint. Thank God for the continuation of what you're doing in Flint. And we pray, God, that the day will come that people will be held criminally charged for what they've done in Flint. Because you know, if that had happened to an affluent community, they'd already be charged. But let us also not forget that 4 million families get up every morning and can buy unleaded gas and can't buy unleaded water. That across this country, 14 million families can't even afford water. And that in Michigan, 25% of the census tracts are at risk for being unable to afford water. 100 years later. We're not blocking European immigrants, we're blocking immigrants from maybe we ought to correct that lie and stop saying that Mexicans are immigrants. We ought to correct that lie. Let's correct that lie. How are you an immigrant when you're coming to a land that nation stole from you? Henry David Thoreau's first act of civil disobedience was the refusal to pay taxes because the Mexican-American War was nothing but a made-up war to take land from the Mexican people because Mexico was anti-slavery. And the Texans wanted to keep their slaves, and then they said, we might as well pick up the gold and the oil of California. So how do you call somebody an alien when they're only returning to their own land? Abraham Lincoln stood up against the Mexican-American War before he was president. And so we've got to correct some lies 100 years later. But what we learn from this history is that every time there's a problem, somebody makes the immigrants to blame. In 1919, it was the European immigrants. 100 years later, it's children in cages. And when I was in El Paso, they told us some stories we haven't heard, like children having to have their shoelaces taken from them because of the traumatic syndrome they're experiencing from the separation. Some had begun to try to hang themselves. 100 years later. 100 years later, we've got 800 military bases around the world. And we currently spend 53 cents of every federal discretionary dollar on the military and only 15 cents on poverty, infrastructure, and education. We could cut the military budget by $350 billion, and we would still be spending more on our military than China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea combined. Dr. King warned us that any nation that is driven by militarism, because the money ain't going to the soldiers, it's going to the military contractors. The average combat soldier only makes about $30-some thousand a year, while the average CEO of a defense contract company makes about $19 million. And one contract of one military contractor for 1 year could fund all of the Medicaid expansion for all 14 states that didn't expand. And Congressman, some people told me don't talk like this, don't talk about, but you got to tell the truth. Dr. King said any nation that focuses more emphasis on militarism than lifting up the people is following the trail of every fallen empire that has ever existed in history. And what is an empire? When your military spending determines everything. That's the definition of an empire. And so here we are 100 years later. And in the midst of this, we've had a presidential election in 2016 where the person really didn't win. We got to stop saying that too. That was a manipulating. I'm not talking about Russia. I'm talking about the Electoral College, voter suppression. The Electoral College has worked 4 times in American history, and every time it was bad. It was bad in 1877, it was bad in 2000, it was bad in 2016. Every time the Electoral College has determined and somebody has won the presidency and not won the popular vote, it's been bad. And we know that it was 88,000 votes or so, 80,000 votes. Thank God for the work the ACLU is doing to open up voting in Michigan for the next election. And while I'm nonpartisan right now, hopefully the Democrats will have learned their lesson and stop trying to build a blue wall and just run a whole America campaign and fight for the votes everywhere, west, east, north, and south. But because of the manipulation, 100 years later, we right back. We got a racist, narcissist, divider-in-chief, and a whole cohort of enablers. I call them the 3 M's, McConnell, Meadows, and McCarthy. McConnell in the Senate, Meadows from North Carolina, and McCarthy in the Congress. And the other day, they voted to go public of the investigation around impeachment. Hallelujah. But I came tonight to say that's that's inside the Congress. And God knows I hope they work inside the Congress. But 100 years later, after you were founded, we need to understand that outside the Congress, we need to do the ACLU. We need to act, we need to challenge, we need to love, and we need to unite. All over, everybody. We need to put down our petty differences between organizations and understand that there are forces out here trying to hurt us all, and there's never been a time for us to act and challenge and love and unite and come together. I often say the body's like this. The same politicians that support voter suppression are the same ones that deny health care, the same ones that deny living wages, are the same ones that hurt the gay community, are the same ones that block climate control and climate and dealing with climate change, are the same ones that hurt public education, are the same ones that vote in ways that creates more mass incarceration. And if they are cynical enough to be together, we ought to be smart enough to come together. It's time to do the ACLU. Act, challenge, love, and unite. And I want you to know that the ACLU didn't really begin in 1919. Because there were folk doing the ACLU long before it was founded as an organization. There were people rising up and recognizing that in every age, you need a group of people who are not afraid to act, not afraid to challenge, not afraid to love deeply, and are not afraid to unite. It was 1852 when Frederick Douglass did the ACLU. A justice by the name of Taney was forced on the Supreme Court, similar to Kavanaugh and others. He should have never been on the Supreme Court. He worked his way to become Chief Justice. He oversaw the Dred Scott decision that said basically a black man has no rights that a white man ever has to pay attention to. And somebody asked Frederick Douglass, what now? What now? What now? What? The Supreme Court has ruled. Frederick Douglass did the ACLU. He didn't just sit down and cry. He said, first of all, you need to understand that yes, there's man's Supreme Court, but then there's another Supreme Court. It's a court of heaven. And then he said, surely you have not forgotten that there was Goliath, but David took him down. You have not forgotten that. And then Frederick Douglass said, let me tell you, I know that these slave masters are committed to holding on to their slaves with everything. He said, but I meet this decision with cheer. This was May 1852. And somebody said, cheer? He said, yes, cheer. He said, because I don't believe it'll stand. And because when I look at history, I recognize sometimes that every attempt to blot out forever the hopes of an enslaved people may just be one necessary link in the chain of events preparatory to the downfall and complete overthrow of the whole slave system. And then Frederick Douglass said, the whole anti-slavery movement is studied with proof that all measures devised and executed with a view to allay and diminish the anti-slavery agitation has only served to increase, intensify, and embolden that agitation. In other words, Douglass was saying right now, in the midst of the worst decision we ever expected, it was time in 1852 to do the ACLU, to act, to challenge, to love, and to unite. Mother Jones, that white labor, religious woman's rights activist in 1800s, people were wrestling and getting tired of fighting for women's suffrage. And Mother Jones said, in essence, she said, it's time to do the ACLU. She told the organization she was with, because some of them said, well, let's pray. And Mother Jones said, we don't need your organization to pray. We need you to fight. She said, the only time you ought to be praying is you pray for the dead, but you fight like hell for the living. That's doing the ACLU. You fight like hell for the living. That's what it means to do the ACLU. Nelson Mandela did the ACLU all the way over in South Africa. He was in jail. They thought they were going to kill him, depress him, break his spirit. He started getting up in that jail, those confines, and preparing himself to be president. He fought from the jail, and he first fought them mentally and spiritually. He would get up in the morning, look at those bars, and instead of crying and whimpering, he would say, out of the night that covers me, black as a pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be. For my unconquerable soul, in the fell clutches of circumstance, I have not winced or cried aloud under the bludgeonings of chance. My head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horrors of the shade, and yet the menace of the years shall find me and find me unafraid. It matters not how straight the gate, nor how charged with punishment the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. That's doing the ACLU. Is never believing that injustice has the last word. Tell you somebody else who did the ACLU before it was even founded. Harriet Tubman. They got a movie coming out. Hope y'all go see it on the 1st. But let me break it down for you Southern style. Harriet Tubman didn't have much. She had epilepsy. Every now and then she'd fall out, just stay out. How can you lead people and sometimes you just fall out? She didn't have a lot of money. All she had was a made-up mind. She had what my grandmama called a strong constitution. She believed in God. She believed that people weren't meant to enslave people. She had moss on the north side of the tree to tell her where the north was. She had the North Star in the sky to tell her where the north was. And she had a pistol in her pocket. Now, the pistol wasn't always for the slave master. Sometimes the pistol was for the slave. Because sometimes folk would run and then they would get out there and they would get scared. And Harriet would say, now you're going to be free. You're going to be free. They said, well, we're going to go back. No. You're not going back. You might go up to heaven, but you're not going back. You're going to be free. And sometimes that would give folk a little spine, some grit in their spine. You're going to be free. That was Harriet Tubman doing the ACLU. She acted, she challenged slavery, she loved her people deeply, and she united folk to fight against slavery. And guess what? She got 500 slaves out of slavery. She didn't have GPS, she didn't have email, she didn't have chat room, she didn't have Facebook. She didn't have Twitter. She didn't have any of that. She didn't have a car. She didn't have a Ford. She didn't have a Chevrolet. I know I shouldn't say that. She didn't have any of that. All she had was a made-up mind and trust in God. And surely if Harriet Tubman was able to act and to challenge and to love and to unite in her time, surely we can act and challenge and love and unify in our time. In our time. In our time, in 1919, your founder said that America would not be final with where it was. In 1919, your founder stood up in the midst of some of the most racist time, and they fought back and built this organization to be one of the strongest organizations in the history of the world. In 1919, your founder said, we can't just be an organization that addresses black folk and another organization that addresses white folk. We have to bring it all together, and we have to first protect freedom of speech and the right to organize and the right to fight back. 100 years later, if we ever needed the ACLU, we sure do need the ACLU now. Is there anybody in here that with everything you have, as long as racism is real, as long as injustice is real, as long as mass incarceration is real, as long as poison water is real, you're going to act, you're going to challenge, you're going to love, and you're going to unify until we are one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. It's time to do the ACLU.